The email arrived late in the evening, just as I was shutting down my laptop for the night. The subject line was stark: evaluation request, Hollow Pines Retreat. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the mouse. Still, curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked. The message was brief. Mr. Grayson, I require your expertise in evaluating a property known as Hollow Pines Retreat. The details are too sensitive to disclose here, but your discretion and thoroughness are paramount. A commission of $25,000 will be provided upon completion. Further instructions will follow. Anonymous, no name, no contact information, just that. I leaned back in my chair, rereading the email. The offer was absurdly generous, too generous. My first instinct was to delete it, to chalk it up to some elaborate scam. But the mention of Hollow Pines stirred something in the back of my mind. I opened a new tab and typed Hollow Pines Retreat into the search bar. The results were sparse. A few scattered mentions on forgotten blogs, a handful of grainy photos, and one outdated website that looked like it hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. The website described Hollow Pines as a serene getaway nestled in the heart of the American Southwest, offering tranquility and rejuvenation for the weary soul. The photos showed a sprawling property surrounded by dense pines, with rustic cabins and a main lodge. But even through the faded images, there was an air of neglect: peeling paint, overgrown paths, windows clouded with grime. I scrolled further, but the site offered little else. No contact information, no recent updates, no indication that the retreat was still operational. I sat back, staring at the screen. There were too many unknowns, too many red flags, but the promise of $25,000 was hard to ignore. And then there was that nagging curiosity, the itch to uncover the story behind the email and the property. I closed the laptop and rubbed my temples. Just a job, I muttered to myself. It's just a job. The decision was made before I even realized it. The next morning, I packed my belongings with methodical precision. A duffel bag for clothes, a smaller bag for essentials, laptop, flashlight, notebook, first aid kit. The drive stretched out before me. The GPS estimated 8 hours, most of it through desolate highways and winding back roads. I filled the tank, stocked up on coffee and snacks, and set off. The first few hours passed uneventfully, the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thrum of tires on asphalt lulling me into a kind of trance. But as the miles ticked by and the landscape grew more barren, unease began to settle. The road narrowed, the trees thickened, and the sky took on a strange, oppressive quality. Clouds hung low, heavy and gray, casting long shadows over the road. I turned off the radio and drove in silence. By the time I reached the turnoff for Hollow Pines, the dirt road stretched ahead, flanked by towering pines that seemed to close in the further I drove. The air felt heavier here, charged with something I couldn't quite name. The retreat was still miles ahead, but already I felt its presence. The road stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of cracked asphalt winding through a landscape that seemed to grow more desolate with each passing mile. The trees that had once flanked the highway had thinned out, replaced by dry scrub and gnarled, twisted shapes that barely resembled vegetation. The air outside the car felt different now, drier, heavier, as though it carried the weight of something unseen. I glanced at the dashboard clock. I'd been driving for nearly 8 hours. Twilight had already deepened into full darkness by the time I'd found my way back to the main route, and now the minutes seemed to crawl unnaturally as I neared my destination. Turn left in 1 mile, the GPS instructed in its flat mechanical tone. Shadows stretched across the road, twisting and shifting as my headlights cut through the void, illuminating the desolate landscape in stark, fleeting flashes. The road had narrowed significantly, the cracked asphalt giving way to rougher terrain. The sense of isolation pressed heavier with each mile. When I finally reached the turnoff, I almost missed it. The dirt road was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and lined with jagged rocks. A rusted iron sign jutted out from the ground, its letters faded and nearly illegible: Hollow Pines Retreat. I slowed the car, the tires crunching over loose gravel as I turned onto the path. The skeletal branches of taller trees arched overhead, blotting out the stars. The air grew colder, sharper, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that I couldn't place. The drive down the dirt road felt endless, the car jostling over uneven ground. It must have been another hour, at least, before I saw the gates. They loomed suddenly out of the darkness, massive iron structures with bars twisted and corroded with rust. They stood as a silent barrier to the retreat, adorned with intricate carvings. Animals, symbols, shapes I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. I stopped the car, staring at them for a moment. The air was unnervingly still, and the only sound was the faint hum of the engine. Then, with a groan that echoed through the trees, the gates began to creak open. I hadn't touched them. No one was there. They moved slowly, the sound grating and metallic, as though protesting their own movement. It was just a mechanism, I told myself, probably triggered by motion sensors. Still, the sight of those gates opening on their own sent a shiver down my spine. I eased the car forward, the tires bumping over uneven ground as I passed through. The property unfolded before me, a sprawling expanse of neglect and decay. Decrepit cottages lined the narrow road, their windows shattered, their roofs sagging under the weight of years. Overgrown weeds choked the yards, and the faint outline of what might have once been a garden was now little more than a tangle of dead plants and broken fencing. The headlights swept over a rusted swing set, its chain swaying slightly in the breeze, or was it the breeze? The road widened as I approached the main plaza, a cluster of dusty stucco buildings arranged around a central courtyard. The structures were worn and weathered, their facades cracked and faded. To my left, a wooden restaurant stood with its sign dangling precariously from one hinge. To the right, a hot spring spa, its once inviting pools now filled with stagnant, murky water. A small chapel sat further back, its steeple leaning at an odd angle, and beside it, a building labeled Museum in peeling paint. At the center of it all stood the inn. It was the largest building by far, its exterior adorned with intricate carvings that seemed almost out of place amidst the decay. Animals and tribal motifs wound their way around the wooden beams, their craftsmanship surprisingly intact despite the disrepair. The building's windows were dark, their glass clouded with grime, and the front door hung slightly ajar, as though inviting me in, or daring me to enter. I parked the car near the courtyard, cutting the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves. Just the faint creak of the car settling and the distant groan of the wind. I stepped out, the gravel crunching underfoot, and took a moment to survey the property. The air was colder here, sharper, and carried with it that same metallic tang. As I stood there, the sound of footsteps broke the stillness. Slow, deliberate, measured. My head snapped toward the source, and from the shadows of the inn, a figure emerged. He was tall and gaunt, his pale complexion almost luminous in the dim light. His black suit was immaculate, the white gloves on his hands pristine despite the surrounding decay. His deep-set gray eyes locked onto mine, unblinking as he approached. Mr. Grayson," he said, his voice smooth and formal. "Welcome to Hollow Pines." The caretaker's gray eyes lingered on mine, unblinking. The silence between us stretched, broken only by the faint creak of the inn's front door swaying slightly in the breeze. I glanced back at the car. The thought of leaving, of turning around and driving back to town, was tempting. But something held me in place. Maybe it was the oppressive stillness of the property, or the way the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. I frowned, glancing at my watch. 7:53 p.m. The dark clouds that had loomed overhead during my drive now blanketed the sky, hastening the onset of night. "You'll find the roads treacherous at night," the caretaker said, his voice cutting through my thoughts. I looked back at him. His posture was rigid, his hands clasped neatly in front of him, the white gloves almost glowing in the dim light. "I was planning to head back to town," I said. "I booked a hotel there." Victor tilted his head slightly. "The nearest town is over an hour away, Mr. Grayson, and the roads unforgiving." I hesitated, glancing back at the car. The idea of navigating the uneven dirt road in complete darkness sent a flicker of unease through me. Victor seemed to sense my hesitation. "You'll find the accommodations here sufficient for the evening," he said, gesturing toward the inn. "It will also give you ample time to begin your evaluation." I hesitated again, my instincts warring with practicality. The logical part of me knew he was right. Staying here would make things easier. But there was something about the man that made my skin crawl. Still, the thought of driving back in the dark, with the memory of those twisting roads fresh in my mind, was enough to tip the scales. "All right," I said finally. "I'll stay the night." Victor's lips curved into a faint smile. "Very good, Mr. Grayson. If you'll follow me, I'll show you to your room." He turned without waiting for a response and began walking toward the inn. I grabbed my duffel bag from the car, the gravel crunching underfoot as I followed him. Inside, the inn was colder than I expected, the air carrying a faint, musty scent. The dim light from a single chandelier overhead cast long, flickering shadows across the room. Taxidermy animals lined the walls, their glass eyes reflecting unsettling glints. A fox with its mouth frozen in a snarl. An owl perched mid-flight, its wings outstretched. A stag's head mounted above the fireplace, its antlers sprawling like skeletal branches. Each piece was meticulously preserved, yet there was something unnatural in the way they seemed to watch me as I moved. At the center of the room stood a long oak table, its surface polished to a dull sheen. The chairs surrounding it were made of bone and leather, the craftsmanship disturbingly intricate. I ran my fingers along the back of one as I passed, the texture cold and smooth. "This way," Victor said, his voice cutting through the silence. He led me up a narrow staircase, the wooden steps creaking under our weight. The hallway at the top was dimly lit, the walls lined with faded wallpaper. The air here felt heavier, almost oppressive. Victor stopped in front of a door near the end of the hall and produced an old-fashioned key from his pocket. He unlocked the door with a soft click and pushed it open, stepping aside to let me enter. The room was modest, with outdated furnishings. A four-poster bed dominated the space, its dark wood frame intricately carved. The mattress was covered in a faded quilt, and a single nightstand stood beside it. A wardrobe sat against the far wall, its doors slightly ajar, revealing empty hangers inside. I set my bag down near the bed, the floorboards creaking beneath me. The walls were bare, save for a single painting above the headboard. A landscape of a dense forest, the trees so dark and twisted they seemed more like shadows than wood. "If you require anything, you need only ask," Victor said, his tone as measured as ever. "Thank you," I said. "Would it be possible to get a quick tour before nightfall?" Victor's expression didn't change, but there was a brief pause before he responded. "Of course," he said. "I'll meet you downstairs shortly." With that, he turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. I stood there for a moment, the silence pressing in around me. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet sounded too deliberate, too purposeful. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to focus. It was just a room, just an old, neglected building. But as I turned toward the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Victor's footsteps echoed faintly down the hall as the door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the dim quiet of the room. I stood there for a moment, staring at the warped wood of the door. The air felt heavier here. I glanced toward the window, but the glass was too grimy to see much beyond vague, shifting shadows of the trees outside. The last traces of daylight had vanished. Though I had planned to leave at dawn, curiosity gnawed at me, refusing to let me rest. Something about this place, its silence, its stillness, demanded answers. I exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of my neck, and grabbed my flashlight from the duffel bag. The idea of wandering this place in near darkness didn't sit well with me, but the thought of staying in this room was worse. I slung the flashlight into my pocket and stepped into the hallway. Victor was waiting at the base of the staircase. His gray eyes met mine the moment I stepped into view. It was as though he had been expecting me. "Shall we begin?" he asked, his voice smooth and measured. I hesitated, adjusting the strap of my bag across my shoulder. "You were waiting for me." Victor's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "I suspected you might wish to see more of the property." Victor turned without another word, his movements precise. I followed him through the main hall, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath our steps the only sound. The chandelier overhead swayed slightly, casting flickering shadows across the taxidermy animals lining the walls. Victor led me out through a side door, into the cold night air. The metallic tang I'd noticed earlier was stronger now, sharp and faintly acrid, like the scent of rusted iron. The courtyard was silent, the wind barely stirring the overgrown weeds that choked the pathways. The buildings loomed around us, their darkened windows like empty sockets. "This way," Victor said. He guided me toward the museum, a squat rectangular building at the far end of the courtyard. Its facade was cracked and weathered, the paint peeling in long, curling strips. Above the door, a faded sign read, "Museum," in blocky, uneven letters. Victor unlocked the door with a key from his pocket and pushed it open. The air inside was colder than I expected, carrying a faint, musty odor that reminded me of damp earth and decaying wood. Victor stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. I hesitated for just a moment before stepping through the threshold. The first thing I noticed was the wax figures. They were arranged in elaborate dioramas, their frozen expressions twisted into grotesque caricatures of life. One scene depicted a violent frontier skirmish with settlers and Native Americans locked in a brutal struggle. Another scene showed a group of pioneers huddled around a campfire, their faces gaunt and hollow-eyed. Victor moved ahead of me, his footsteps unnervingly silent on the creaking floorboards. "The museum was once a centerpiece of the retreat," he said, his voice low and even. "A place to honor the history of the region." I followed him deeper into the building, my eyes drawn to the other exhibits. Animal skeletons were displayed in glass cases, their bones arranged in ceremonial poses. One skeleton, a wolf by the look of it, was draped in tattered fabric adorned with faded symbols. Another case held a collection of artifacts attributed to the region's Native American tribes, arrowheads, pottery shards, and what appeared to be a ceremonial mask carved from dark wood. The mask's hollow eye sockets seemed to follow me as I moved. Victor stopped in front of a particularly large display case, his gloved hand resting lightly on the glass. Inside was a collection of tools, rusted knives, saws, and other implements I couldn't identify. Each one was stained with dark rust-colored streaks. "These were recovered from the property during its restoration," Victor said. "Artifacts of a darker chapter in its history." I frowned, leaning closer to the glass. The tools looked more like instruments of torture than anything practical. "What kind of history are we talking about?" Victor's eyes flicked toward me, the kind best left in the past. Before I could press him further, something else caught my attention, a door at the back of the museum. It was heavy and reinforced, with thick iron bands crisscrossing its surface. A large padlock hung from the latch, its metal tarnished and pitted with age. "What's behind that door?" I asked, nodding toward it. Victor's posture stiffened, and his gray eyes grew colder. "That is a storage area," he said, his voice clipped. "It is not open to guests." I raised an eyebrow. "Storage for what?" Victor's gaze lingered on me for a moment. "Artifacts that are not suitable for display." The way he said it sent a chill through me. His tone was calm, measured, but there was an edge to it, something sharp and unyielding. I nodded slowly, deciding not to push the issue. Victor turned abruptly. "We should continue," he said. "The hour grows late." I followed him out of the museum, casting one last glance at the locked door before stepping back into the cold night. Victor led me back to the inn without another word, his pace steady and deliberate. When we reached the front door, he stopped and turned to face me. "That concludes the tour," he said. "I trust you'll find your accommodations adequate." I nodded. "Thanks." Victor inclined his head slightly before he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the inn. I stood there for a moment before making my way back to my room. The air inside was oppressive. I set my bag down by the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the faded painting above the headboard. The twisted trees in the image seemed to shift in the dim light. I exhaled slowly, running a hand through my hair. Whatever this place was, it wasn't just a neglected retreat. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain but could feel in my bones. I resolved to leave at first light. Several hours later, in the dead of night, I lay awake in the suffocating room. The air felt heavier the longer I stayed, pressing down on my chest like an invisible weight. I had tried to sleep, but the bed was as unyielding as the atmosphere, and every time I closed my eyes, I felt as though something was watching me. The painting above the headboard didn't help. Its twisted, shadowy trees seemed to writhe in the dim light, their gnarled branches reaching for something unseen. I had turned my back to it, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, looming. The events of the day replayed in my mind, refusing to let me rest. The museum, the tour, Victor's explanations, they should have been enough to satisfy my curiosity. I had resolved to leave at dawn, to put this strange place behind me, but the unease that had taken root during the tour had only grown. The locked door in the museum lingered in my thoughts, an itch I couldn't scratch. And now, in the oppressive silence of the room, the questions I'd tried to push aside clawed their way back. What was behind that door? Why had Victor seemed so evasive, so eager to move us along? I lay on my side, staring at the faint outline of the wardrobe against the far wall. The silence in the inn was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the old building settling. I told myself it was just the wood expanding and contracting with the night air, but the sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint, almost imperceptible sound that could have been the breeze slipping through cracks in the walls. But as I strained to listen, I realized it wasn't random. The murmurs were low and guttural, just beyond the edge of comprehension. Words, if they were words, twisted and distorted into something alien. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the room like a cold draft. I sat up, my breath shallow. The whispers faded, but the silence that followed was worse. It was the kind of silence that made your ears strain, desperate to fill the void with anything. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, gripping it tightly, though I didn't turn it on. The weight of it in my hand was a small comfort. A faint scratching sound broke the stillness, coming from the door. My head snapped toward it. The sound was soft at first, like fingernails dragging lightly across the wood. Then it grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was on the other side was testing the barrier, searching for a way in. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I stared at the door, waiting for it to burst open. But it didn't. The scratching stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving me in a silence so thick I could barely breathe. I stood there, my muscles tense, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. But where? The hallway beyond the door felt just as dangerous as the room itself. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. A wailing sound shattered the silence. It started low, almost like a moan, but it rose quickly, growing louder and more frenzied. It was inhuman, a sound that didn't belong in this world. The wail echoed through the inn, reverberating off the walls and filling every corner of the room. It was coming from outside. I stumbled toward the window, my legs shaky beneath me. The glass was clouded with grime, but I could make out faint shapes moving in the darkness beyond. Shadows twisted and writhed, their forms indistinct, like smoke caught in a violent wind. The wailing grew louder, more piercing, until it felt like it was coming from inside my skull. I fumbled with the latch and shoved the window open. The cold night air hit me, sharp and biting, carrying with it that same metallic tang I'd noticed earlier during my walk around the grounds. I leaned out, squinting into the darkness, trying to make sense of the shifting shapes below. Then it came. A scream, high-pitched and guttural, erupted from the shadows. It was raw, primal, filled with a rage and despair that made my stomach churn. It hit me like a physical force, and I reeled backward, my head slamming against the edge of the window frame. The flashlight slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor as I scrambled to shut the window, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the latch. The scream cut off abruptly as the window slammed shut. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was charged, alive with the memory of that sound. My ears rang and I could still feel the scream reverberating through my body. I couldn't stay here. Not in this room, not in this inn. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air too thick to breathe. My eyes fell on the flashlight, and as I bent to pick it up, my fingers brushed against the jagged rock I'd pocketed earlier in the day. Now, it felt like the only weapon I had. I eased the door open, wincing at the faint creak of the hinges. The hallway was dark, the faint light from the chandelier below barely reaching this far. I stepped out, my footsteps slow and deliberate, the floorboards groaning beneath me. The oppressive weight of the silence remained, pressing down on me with every step. The museum, the locked door, the tools, the artifacts. Something about it called to me, a pull I couldn't explain. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the gnawing curiosity that had brought me here in the first place. Either way, I found myself moving toward the staircase, my flashlight clutched tightly in one hand, the rock in the other. The inn seemed to hold its breath as I descended, the shadows deeper and more menacing than before. The taxidermy animals on the walls seemed to shift in the dim light, their glass eyes glinting as though they were alive. I kept my gaze forward, refusing to look at them for too long. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, the cold night air rushing in to greet me. The courtyard was eerily still. My footsteps crunched softly on the gravel as I made my way toward the museum, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. The metallic tang in the air was stronger now, almost suffocating, and I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the taste of it on my tongue. The museum door loomed ahead, its peeling paint and cracked facade even more foreboding in the faint light. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, the cold metal biting into my palm. I hesitated before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The musty scent hit me immediately, stronger than before, and I fought the urge to gag. The wax figures were still there, their frozen expressions twisted and grotesque in the flashlight's beam. I moved quickly until I reached the back of the room. The locked door stood before me, its iron bands gleaming faintly in the light. The padlock was massive, its surface pitted with age. Whatever was behind that door, I had to know. The faintest sound came from behind me. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Slowly I turned, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I swept it across the room. Nothing, but the air felt heavier, as though the room itself was watching me. I turned back to the door, gripping the rock tightly in my hand. Whatever was behind this door, it was waiting. Several hours had passed since the oppressive unease of the inn had driven me to sleeplessness. The whispers of the locals and the hurried tone of the museum guide had rooted themselves in my mind, growing louder with every passing minute. I couldn't shake the image of her darting eyes when she mentioned the locked door, nor the hushed warnings about the museum's dark past and the watcher in the shadows. The more I tried to dismiss it, the more the unease festered, until I found myself pacing the small room. The decision to return to the museum wasn't conscious. It felt inevitable, as though something unseen was pulling me back. By the time I realized where my restless feet were taking me, I was already standing before the museum's darkened facade. Inside, the air was colder than I remembered, the silence even more suffocating. The lock on the forbidden door was old, its surface pitted and corroded, but it didn't give easily. My hand trembled as I raised the jagged rock I'd found outside, the weight of it unfamiliar in my grip. I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder at the museum's dim storage area. The faint outlines of crates and forgotten artifacts loomed in the shadows. I turned back to the door. The padlock gleamed faintly in the beam of my flashlight. I brought the rock down hard. The sound of metal striking metal echoed through the room, sharp and jarring, and I froze. Nothing stirred. I struck again, harder this time. The lock groaned, the iron bands rattling against the door. A third strike, and the padlock gave way with a sharp crack, the latch springing open. The silence that followed was deafening. I reached for the door, my fingers brushing against the cold, rough wood. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest, and a gust of damp, cold air rushed out to meet me, carrying with it a faint, acrid smell. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase, descending steeply into darkness. I hesitated at the top, shining the flashlight down the steps. The beam barely penetrated the gloom, but I could make out the rough stone walls, slick with moisture, and the faint flicker of light far below. I stepped onto the first stair, the wood creaking beneath my weight. I winced, glancing back over my shoulder. The museum's storage room remained still, but the oppressive weight of the silence made it feel as though something unseen was watching. I forced myself to move, descending slowly, one step at a time. The air grew colder with each step, the dampness clinging to my skin and seeping into my clothes. The faint light below grew stronger, resolving into the flickering glow of candles. The staircase ended abruptly, opening into a small underground chamber. The walls were rough stone, slick with condensation, and the air was thick with the mingling scents of wax, blood, and decay. At the center of the room stood an altar. Black candles burned at its corners, their flames casting jagged shadows that danced across the walls. The altar itself was adorned with bloodied animal organs, their raw, glistening surfaces arranged in a macabre display. At its center stood a statue of the Virgin Mary. Her hollow eyes wept dark, viscous fluid that dripped slowly down her face, pooling at the base of the statue. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. A red leather-bound book lay open on the altar, its pages filled with cryptic symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering candlelight. The writing was unlike anything I'd ever seen, sharp, angular lines that twisted into shapes that hurt to look at for too long. The air around the altar felt heavier, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. A sound behind me shattered the stillness, a faint creak like the shifting of weight on the staircase. I froze. Slowly I turned, the flashlight beam sweeping up the narrow stairs. At the top, crouched in the shadows, was a figure. It was pale, its emaciated frame stretched unnaturally thin. Its limbs were elongated, its fingers tipped with jagged, blackened nails that scraped lightly against the stone wall. Its head was misshapen, slightly too large for its neck, and its black, lifeless eyes glistened with malice. The creature's mouth opened, revealing jagged, uneven teeth, and it let out a guttural shriek that echoed through the chamber. The creature moved. It descended the stairs with a jerky, unnatural speed, its limbs bending at impossible angles as it closed the distance between us. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, stumbling backward toward the altar. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the ground and spinning wildly, its beam casting chaotic shadows across the walls. The creature's shriek grew louder as it lunged for me. Then a voice, deep, commanding and resonant, it echoed through the chamber, cutting through the creature's cries. The words were incomprehensible, guttural and sharp, but they carried an undeniable authority. I whipped my head toward the source and froze. The figure from the locals' warnings, the one they called the Watcher, stood at the far edge of the chamber. Cloaked in dark robes, their face obscured by a deep hood, they radiated an eerie calm. The creature froze mid-lunge, its body contorted in a grotesque pose, its black eyes wide and unblinking. The voice continued, reverberating through the air, and the oppressive energy in the room seemed to shift, growing heavier, darker. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, its body trembling as though caught between two forces. Its black eyes flicked toward me, filled with a hatred so intense it made my stomach twist. Then, with a final, shuddering breath, it retreated, its elongated limbs folding awkwardly as it scrambled back up the stairs and disappeared into the darkness. The silence that followed was suffocating. My legs trembled beneath me. The candles on the altar flickered violently, their flames bending as though caught in an unseen wind. My eyes darted toward the staircase, half expecting the creature to return, but the shadows remained still. I turned back to the altar, the red book still open, its cryptic symbols seeming to pulse faintly in the candlelight. The air around it felt alive, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. My hands shook as I reached for the flashlight, its beam now weak and flickering, and I forced myself to take a step back, away from the altar, away from the book. The robed figure remained silent, unmoving, but the weight of their presence filled the chamber. Their head tilted slightly toward me, and for a moment I thought I saw a faint glint of eyes beneath the hood. The locals' warnings rang in my mind again, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had just happened was far from over. Later that night, I couldn't stand it any longer. Sleep had evaded me entirely, my mind plagued by the oppressive silence of the inn and the gnawing memory of the museum's locked chamber. My plan to leave at dawn felt impossible now. Every fiber of my being screamed that I couldn't wait. Before I fully realized it, I was out of bed, pulling on my jacket, and stepping out into the cool night air. The streets were empty as I made my way back toward the museum. The grounds were eerily still when I arrived, the faint rustle of leaves the only sound as I approached. My car sat in the courtyard where I had left it, but I barely glanced at it, my focus drawn entirely to the museum. The main doors were locked, as I expected, but the side entrance to the storage area gave way with a tentative push. The faint creak of the door sent a shiver down my spine. As I slipped inside, the air immediately cooler and heavier. I told myself I was only here to satisfy my curiosity, to peer into the forbidden underground chamber one last time before leaving this place for good. The storage area was cluttered with sheet-covered objects, their shapes looming in the dim light. I moved carefully through the maze of artifacts, my flashlight cutting a narrow path through the gloom, until I found the staircase that led down to the chamber. As I descended, the air grew colder, the faint metallic tang stronger now, almost suffocating. The oppressive weight of the place settled on my shoulders, and I hesitated at the bottom step, my flashlight trembling in my hand. That's when I saw him. The robed figure emerged from the shadows without warning, his movements slow and deliberate. The jeweled dagger in his hand caught the flickering candlelight that lined the chamber, the gems embedded in its hilt glinting. His hood obscured most of his face, but those piercing blue eyes, sharp and faintly glowing, locked onto me with an intensity that rooted me to the spot. The creature crept into view at the base of the stairs, its elongated limbs twitching with barely restrained energy. It let out a low, guttural growl, its black eyes darting between me and the robed man. The man turned his head toward it sharply. "Enough," he said, the single word dripping with authority. His tone was calm, measured, but there was a venomous edge beneath it. "You've done your part. Do not embarrass me further." The creature recoiled as if struck, its body folding in on itself. Its claws scraped lightly against the stone floor, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. The man's gaze lingered on the creature for a moment longer, before he turned his attention back to me. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and resonant. "But perhaps this is fate." I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my chest tight. The dagger in his hand gleamed as he raised it slightly, the blade catching the light. He took a step forward, and I instinctively backed away, my heel brushing against the edge of the altar. The cold, damp air of the chamber pressed against my skin, and the metallic tang in the air seemed to thicken, coating my tongue. "Do you know what this place is?" he asked, his tone almost conversational, though there was a sinister undercurrent to his words. "Do you know what it requires?" I shook my head, my throat too dry to speak. My eyes darted to the staircase, but the creature still crouched there, its black eyes glinting with malice. There was no way out. The man took another step closer, the dagger now fully raised. "Sacrifice," he said, the word hanging in the air like a curse. "Transformation. You are here for a reason, Mr. Grayson. You are here to become." The last word sent a jolt of terror through me, and my body finally responded. My hand shot out, grabbing the edge of the altar for support as I stumbled backward. My eyes flickered briefly to the grotesque relic resting atop it, the Virgin Mary statue, its once sacred features now corrupted by a dripping black ichor. The man lunged forward, the dagger flashing in the dim light. I didn't think. I just reacted. With a burst of adrenaline, I shoved him as hard as I could, my hands colliding with his chest. He staggered back, his footing slipping on the slick stone floor. I didn't wait to see if he recovered. I turned and bolted up the stairs, the creature's claws raking my back as I fled. The pain was blinding, but I didn't stop. I burst into the courtyard and scanned the area wildly. My car was still there, but as I ran toward it, my stomach dropped. The hood was open, the engine exposed, wires dangling. It had been sabotaged. I turned sharply at the sound of an engine rumbling nearby. A truck sat idling in the shadows, its headlights off, the faint glow of the dashboard the only light. It was parked across the narrow driveway, blocking any chance of escape. Whoever was in that truck, they were waiting for me. Desperate, I turned and ran toward a small building nearby, a separate storage facility I had noticed earlier, set apart from the main museum. I shoved the door open and slipped inside, slamming it shut behind me. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of dust and mildew. My flashlight flickered weakly as I scanned the room, the sheet-covered objects looming around me. I crouched behind one of the larger shapes, my back pressed against the cold wall, and tried to steady my breathing. My hands trembled as I gripped the flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting through the gloom. The sound of footsteps outside made my blood run cold. They were slow and deliberate, the gravel crunching softly underfoot. A low growl followed, guttural and menacing. The door creaked open, and I heard the robed man's voice, calm and commanding. "Find him," he said. "He cannot leave." The creature let out a low snarl, and I heard the sound of its claws scraping against the floor as it entered the building. I pressed myself tighter against the wall, my body trembling. The robed man's footsteps followed, slow and measured. He had tracked me from the chamber, his presence unrelenting. I shifted slightly, trying to stay hidden, but my hand brushed against something cold and smooth. I turned my head, my flashlight trembling as I shone it on the object beside me. The sheet covering it had slipped, revealing what lay beneath. It was a grotesque sculpture, a nightmarish amalgamation of human remains stitched together into a pulsating form. Limbs jutted out at odd angles, their bones mismatched and bound with sinew. The surface of the thing glistened, as though alive, and its many eyes, human eyes, stared back at me, unblinking. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream, my stomach twisting with nausea and terror. The sculpture seemed to move, its flesh rippling faintly as though it were breathing. The sound of the robed man's voice cut through the silence again, closer this time. "Do not hide, Mr. Grayson," he said, his tone almost mocking. "You cannot escape what is already in motion." The creature let out another growl, its claws scraping closer. I pressed myself tighter against the wall, my eyes locked on the horrifying sculpture as it seemed to pulse with life. The sculpture's many eyes bore into me unblinking, their glassy surfaces reflecting the weak beam of my flashlight. My breath came in shallow gasps, the air thick with the mingling scents of decay and mildew. The robed man's footsteps grew louder, deliberate, each one a drumbeat of inevitability. The pale creature's guttural growl echoed through the room, its claws scraping against the floor as it prowled closer. I was trapped, pinned between the wall and the grotesque abomination that seemed to pulse faintly, as though it were alive. The robed man's voice broke the silence, smooth and reverent. "Do you see it, Mr. Grayson?" His tone was almost tender, as though he were speaking of something sacred. "This is the pinnacle of creation, the art of transformation, flesh, bone, and will bound together into something eternal." I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my legs refusing to obey. The abomination beside me shifted, its glistening surface rippling like water disturbed by a stone. The faint wet sound of its movement sent a shiver down my spine. The robed man stepped closer, his jeweled dagger catching the faint light as he gestured toward the sculpture. "This," he continued, his voice softening, "is the culmination of centuries of devotion. A masterpiece born of sacrifice. Do you not feel its power, its purpose?" The pale creature let out a low snarl, its black, lifeless eyes fixed on me. It crouched low, its elongated limbs twitching. The robed man raised a hand, silencing it with a single commanding gesture. "Patience," he said, his voice firm. "The transformation must be embraced, not forced." The sculpture moved again. One of its many limbs, a grotesque amalgamation of sinew and bone, twitched, then stretched outward with a sickening crack. My stomach churned as I watched the abomination shift, its mismatched parts writhing as though awakening from a deep slumber. The robed man turned toward it, his posture reverent. "Yes," he whispered. "It stirs. It knows." The sculpture lunged. The movement was sudden and impossibly fast. One of its limbs shot out, striking the robed man square in the chest. The force of the blow sent him sprawling backward, his dagger clattering to the floor. The abomination descended upon him. Its many limbs moved with a horrifying fluidity, tearing into him. Flesh and fabric shredded beneath its claws, blood spraying across the room. The robed man screamed, a raw, guttural sound that was quickly drowned out by the wet, tearing noises of the abomination's assault. He reached out, his gloved hand grasping for the dagger, but another limb lashed out, snapping his arm with a sickening crack. His screams faltered, then ceased altogether as the abomination tore him apart. The pale creature let out a deafening shriek as it launched itself at the abomination. Its claws raked across the abomination's surface, but the blows seemed to have no effect. The abomination turned on the creature with a speed that made my breath catch. One of its limbs coiled around the creature's neck, lifting it off the ground with ease. The pale creature thrashed wildly, its elongated limbs flailing, but it was no match. The abomination tightened its grip, and with a sickening crunch, the creature's body went limp. The abomination tossed the lifeless form aside, its many eyes turning toward me. My back pressed against the cold wall, the flashlight slipping from my trembling hand and clattering to the floor. The beam flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows across the room as the abomination loomed closer. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My entire body was paralyzed with fear as the abomination reached for me. Its limbs moved with a grotesque grace, the mismatched bones and sinew glistening in the faint light. I braced myself, expecting the same violent end that had befallen the others. But it didn't attack. Instead, one of its limbs, long and skeletal, wrapped around me. The touch was cold as it lifted me effortlessly off the ground. My vision blurred. The abomination carried me toward the door, its movements deliberate and unhurried. The cold night air hit me as the abomination stepped outside, the metallic tang of blood still thick in my nostrils. My body felt weightless, my limbs numb as the abomination carried me further from the building. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me was the faint glimmer of stars above, then nothing. The first thing I felt was the cold. It seeped through my clothes, biting into my skin, dragging me back to consciousness. My head throbbed, a dull, rhythmic pounding that seemed to echo in my skull. Slowly, I opened my eyes, squinting against the harsh light of the morning sun. The sky above was a pale, washed-out blue, streaked with thin clouds. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The world around me was blurry, unfocused. Flashes of the night before came back to me in fragments, running through the woods, branches clawing at my skin, my breath ragged and burning. I remembered the abomination, its grotesque form looming in the darkness, and the robed man's voice chanting words that twisted the air. I'd fled Hollow Pines in a blind panic, my only thought to escape. Somehow I'd stumbled onto a dirt road, collapsing under the weight of exhaustion and terror. A figure had appeared then, an old man with a lantern in hand. He'd said something, his voice calm and steady, but I couldn't make out the words. I remembered the sting of antiseptic, the press of bandages, and the warmth of a blanket before the darkness swallowed me again. I shifted now, and pain shot through my back and shoulders, sharp and immediate. I groaned, the sound barely audible over the faint rustle of wind through dry grass. My hands moved instinctively, brushing against the rough gravel beneath me. I was lying on the side of a road, the asphalt cracked and weathered, stretching endlessly in both directions. The air smelled faintly of dust and pine, but there was something else, a faint metallic tang that made my stomach twist. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, every muscle in my body protesting the movement. My clothes were damp with dew, clinging to my skin, and my hands trembled as I tried to steady myself. That's when I noticed the bandages. My arms were wrapped in clean white gauze, the fabric tight but not constricting. There was a faint, rusty stain on the bandage around my left forearm, but the wound beneath it didn't throb. Someone had tended to me, someone had patched me up. But who? I scanned the road. The highway was empty, the surrounding landscape barren, except for a few scattered trees and patches of dry grass. The silence was broken only by the occasional chirp of a bird or the distant hum of insects. My breath hitched, and I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to calm the rising panic. A sound broke through the stillness, a low rumble growing louder. I turned my head and saw a vehicle approaching in the distance. It was a state trooper's car, the black and white paint, unmistakable even from this distance. Relief and dread warred within me as the car slowed, its tires crunching on the gravel shoulder as it pulled to a stop a few feet away. The engine idled, a steady hum. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a neatly pressed uniform and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached, his movements deliberate but cautious. He stopped a few feet away, his hand resting lightly on the radio clipped to his belt. "You all right there, son?" His voice was deep, steady. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My throat was dry, my tongue heavy, and all I could manage was a faint croak. The trooper frowned as he took a step closer. "Hey," he said, his tone softening. "You hurt? Can you tell me what happened?" I shook my head, the motion sluggish. My mind was a jumbled mess, the memories slipping through my fingers. I tried to speak again, forcing the words out through cracked lips. I don't know," I rasped. "I don't remember." The trooper's frown deepened. He glanced back at his car, then returned his attention to me. "All right," he said slowly. "Let's get you some help. Can you stand?" I hesitated, then nodded. He reached out and helped me to my feet. The world tilted dangerously, and I swayed. The trooper steadied me and guided me toward the car. The leather of the seat was warm against my back as I sank into it. The trooper climbed into the driver's seat. He reached for the radio, his voice calm as he spoke into it. "Dispatch, this is Unit 27. I've got a male, early 30s, found on the side of Route 16 near mile marker 112. Appears disoriented, possibly injured. Requesting medical assistance at St. Mary's Hospital." The radio crackled, and a faint voice responded, but I didn't catch the words. My head lolled against the seat, my eyes half closed as exhaustion pulled at me. The trooper glanced at me before shifting the car into gear. The engine rumbled as we pulled back onto the highway, the tires humming against the asphalt. The drive passed in a blur. The trooper asked me a few more questions, my name, where I was from, what I was doing out here, but I couldn't give him any answers. Every time I tried to focus, to remember, the images slipped away, leaving only a gnawing sense of dread. By the time we reached the hospital, the sun was high in the sky, its light harsh and unrelenting. The trooper helped me out of the car, his grip firm as he guided me toward the entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, and the cool, sterile air of the hospital washed over me. Nurses and orderlies moved quickly as they took me from the trooper's care and led me to a small examination room. The next few hours passed in a haze. Doctors and nurses asked questions, their voices blending into a distant hum. They examined my wounds, their hands gentle but clinical. I told them about the bandages, about waking up on the side of the road, but when they pressed me for more details, I had none to give. At some point, they left me alone in the room. I stared at the ceiling, fragmented memories swirling like a storm. The abomination, the robed man, the creature, the screams, the locked door, the altar, the book. The images came in flashes, vivid and horrifying, but they refused to form a coherent picture. Eventually, they moved me to a private room. The bed was stiff, the sheets scratchy, but I barely noticed. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to rest. I stared out the window, watching the clouds drift across the sky. The world outside seemed so normal, so indifferent, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The memories wouldn't leave me. I tried to tell myself it was over, that I was safe, but the words felt hollow. The horrors of Hollow Pines Retreat were behind me, but I knew deep down that a part of me was still there, trapped. I closed my eyes, but the darkness offered no solace.